thank you so much for joining me today. Your book, very enlightening and also a little bit scary because I realized just how many people around me who I thought were maybe a little selfish or just had an attitude issue or had something going on might actually have something pathological going on and or not. But I also wanted to have this conversation because not only is it important to be able to spot a narcissist, but also spot those who aren't pathological or clinical narcissist, aka normal people having a bad day or a bad week or a bad year. Also, what we can do about these people if we find one in our circle, at home or at work. And the book did not disappoint. I'll link to it in the show notes, but it's kind of 3 books in one, in my opinion, or maybe 2 long ones in one. But I appreciated that. I don't think I have that many clinical narcissists in my life, certainly not in my family, but I still found this really fascinating. And I think the listeners will as well.
Thank you so much. I think it's such an important topic. You're blessed if you don't have a lot in your family, because I think what we have to recognize is that there's a continuum, right? For some people, this is the annoying friend, the annoying colleague. For other people, it decimated their childhood or it's destroyed a marriage. So you can imagine there's a wide range of differences in how people are having to deal with this. And I think that also fuels some of the confusion.
I think that's probably true. Look, it's since I am not an expert in this area by any stretch, I'm as lay a layman as they get. It's hard for me to think of all the people in my past who have been like, that person maybe was a narcissist, because it's such a tricky definition. And it seems like narcissistic behavior is on the rise. We see it a lot in the media. So there could also be the spotlight effect here, where since I'm reading about it constantly and the word is almost sort of buzzwordy these days, that I'll put it this way. Whenever anybody's kind of a jerk in line anywhere, you'll hear the word narcissist thrown around. It doesn't matter if it's a celebrity, somebody on TV, Harvey Weinstein, all the way down to the person who's yelling at somebody at Target. It just kind of, it's everywhere, seemingly.
It is everywhere. And I think that what's happening is a couple of things happening, right? One of the issues with narcissism is consistency. So you made a point earlier, this idea of a bad day, right? And so what if any one of us is graceless on a bad day? I've had my moments where I've melted down at someone, I didn't get enough sleep or whatever it might have been happening. But what we look for is how quickly a person attempts to make it right. So they might say, oh my gosh, I am so sorry, I had no right to do that. It's a very honest apology. It's not a I'm sorry you feel that way apology. It's actually a genuine apology. And secondly, people will actually notice that that's off brand for that person. Like, that's not who they are. Now with a narcissistic person, this is consistently who they are. A person will say, you use a celebrity example like a Harvey Weinstein. That was a scandal that unfolded over a very long time. Mm-hmm. That was consistent behavior, sort of who the person is. So I think that consistency and then the is one big piece. And then when someone behaves badly, we look at how quickly they try to repair it. Narcissistic people don't ever try to repair unless their feet are held to the fire. A publicist or someone else says, you need to apologize. Or the family says, you need to apologize. And that's when you get the I'm sorry you feel that way nonsense apologies. But is it everywhere? Here's the thing. This term, narcissism, in the literature, in psychological literature, has only been around for about a little over 100 years. And so in the field of psychology is in its relative infancy too, compared to all of the other sciences, if you want to view it that way. But when we take it back to its beginning, we had people like Havelock Ellis and Otto Rank, who talked about it initially. Freud was the one who took the first biggest plunge into narcissism. But I got to tell you, Jordan, this is something that even in the theoretical literature, other than the psychoanalysts, no one touches. So this was a word nobody was really using. We're so stuck on the myth of Narcissus, who looked at his reflection in the water and he fell in love with himself, which actually isn't what happened in the myth. In the myth, he was cursed to only love himself and not be able to love anyone else. And he killed himself. So, like, Narcissus is not about the beautiful boy who loved himself. It's actually about the beautiful boy who was cursed. And I think that that's actually the more accurate telling of what narcissism is. And so, this idea of is it on the rise? There's sort of two schools of thought. Some folks, and this is based in the literature, have said it's actually not on the rise, and every generation thinks that adolescents are more narcissistic than they were, right?
Okay.
So that's because adolescents are narcissistic. All
Yeah.
of them without exception, because that's what their brain is doing. The way the brain develops in adolescence, it's selfishness, it's I like my friends better than my family, okay?
Okay.
Now, where I'm going to challenge that is let's leave the adolescents alone. Their brain is sort of doing what their brain's doing. It's in the population as a whole, what has changed in about the last 25 years is the ways people can sort of exert this narcissistic instinct. And that really played out with things like social media, reality television, sort of the democratization of celebrity. If you're willing to act foolish enough, you too can be famous. And so it used to be if a person wanted to get narcissistic validation in the 70s or even in the 80s, you actually had to kind of put on your face and get dressed and leave the house because no one was going to walk into your front door and validate you. Well, now they do through these devices. And then you throw in there things like frictionless economies and stuff. We don't even have to make nice anymore. Somebody just puts our groceries on our step. So all of those technological influences and media influences, I think it has taken what was always a lot of narcissists in the population and given them this huge platform. And then you throw other social issues on top of that, like income inequality. And the fact is that it isn't about if you work harder, you'll make more money. So people are frustrated. Narcissists, when they're frustrated, get really, really angry. And now what's happening is we're giving this huge platform to uncivil behavior and really bad behavior. So all of these things are sort of mushed up to result in what seems like more narcissism. I think what we see now, Jordan, is more demonstrative narcissism. There's always been narcissists, even before we had a name for it. The difference is now it's more performative and there's platforms for it.
Is narcissism contagious, the behavior itself? You know, if I see somebody getting away with it, are other people going to start to try and do the same? I'm thinking of celebrities, politicians, musicians, artists, whatever. I wonder if, yes, kids probably, because they're impressionable, they're going to do this. But I wonder, are people who are watching YouTubers and reality TV show stars behaving badly, are they going to start to try and do that? Not just because they're role playing and trying it on, but because they're like, look, man, look at what this person's getting away with. Why should I follow the rules? Or are those people already narcissists? They just didn't have the guts to be as awful as the people on TV until they saw that it was being rewarded.
So narcissism's on a continuum, right? From really sort of low, mild levels of it all the way to the most severe malignant versions. And those look quite different. This idea of narcissism contagion, there's sort of a couple of ways that could play out. A personality style is not contagious. The bricks of personality start building, honestly, before we're born, because we have sort of an inborn temperament. So a person who is a 35-year-old, who's a decent person, who's not narcissistic, who does have empathy, who sees someone behaving badly, may in that moment witness that entitlement saying, oh, it looks like we have to all cut the line. But in general, you're not going to all of a sudden, a person's not going to switch and have a different personality. So you're not going to see a personality switch. What you might see is sort of this selected behavioral switches. So people saying, well, entitlement seems like the only way to get ahead. So I'm going to be entitled. I'm going to act like the rule doesn't apply to me. But I'll tell you the difference in that person who might saying, well, he's getting away with it, so I'm going to try to get away with it. That person who's sort of following along, it feels more uncomfortable for them because it's sort of not who they are, because their empathy kicks in and says, well, this isn't cool. Those other people have been waiting in line for 20 minutes, even though everyone else is jumping. I don't feel good about this. Some people might take an unkind attitude and say, well, it's a dog eat dog world. So if you're just going to stand in line, okay, so, I wouldn't want to date you if that's your attitude. So now let's jump to the relational space, because what I have worked with many people who have been in long-term, like intimate relationships, marriages, long-term committed relationships with narcissistic people. And what they've said is not only was this horribly abusive, they found themselves almost like in order to survive in that relationship, starting to feel like more they could only survive by being an asshole. So
Hmm.
they were starting to be more assholey just to keep the trains moving in their lives. But then they'd find that that assholiness that they were exerting perhaps in a marriage, now they were pulling that stunt with a friend, and their friend would be like, slow down, sister. Like, no, 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 this
Hmm.
is not working for me. And then the person would say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Whereas a narcissistic person behaving like an ass would never say I'm sorry. So that contagion is definitely there. And I do think where we see a lot of it play out is in internet trolling, internet comments. I think people are more dysregulated. I think people are snappy, but I don't know. I think that you're not going to take an agreeable person and make them narcissistic. That's just not going to happen.
That's good. Yeah, I have some more questions about these dysregulations and people in relationships with narcissists later on as well. I found the concept of habituation insightful, where, and let me paraphrase here and tell me if I get it right. Most people with narcissists in their lives, they end up with multiple narcissists in their lives because of, in part, co-narcissism. What is this? This is, it sounds kind of horrible.
Well, so, it's almost like you get into this toxic dance, right? So you brought up this idea of habituation. Habituation is a concept that comes from behavioral science, that basically it's the old boiling the frog. You kind of get used to something, and in that case, the frog dies, but we get used to things. So if your house backs up to a train track, for the first year, it might be like, oh my gosh, this is so loud. After about a year, you're not even gonna, maybe even sooner, you're not going to notice that noise anymore. We get used to things in our environment. Well, that can happen with narcissism as well. We sort of habituate to abruptness, coldness, dismissiveness, manipulativeness, all of it. We just almost, we sort of get used to it, not in a good
Uh-huh.
way. It's almost like secondhand smoke. We may get used to it, but ultimately we're going to get sick. And so what happens though with that co-narcissism is you kind of get caught in that toxic dance. You know how to be narcissistic supply. You sort of play to their rules because they're so much more loud and angry that everyone sort of starts changing to the narcissistic person. So what happens is you're no longer discerning. So when a new narcissistic person rolls up, just like those train tracks, you're so used to loud noise out your window that when there's new loud noise, when there's a new person behaving like this, you don't say, stop, red light, toxic. You're like, okay, well, this person's just like my dad, so come on in. There's no, you lose that kind of discrimination, but that ability to sort of choose because you're not thinking like this is awful, and because no one's teaching people that narcissistic behavior is not a good thing. A lot of people give it a free pass and say, yeah, that's just how they are.
Yeah, okay, this makes sense. So the filter is off and it's what you know. Would you go as far as to say maybe you even seek it out because you're already good at managing it if your parents are narcissists or if your ex is a narcissist?
I wouldn't say seek it out because I think that puts an unfair onus on someone who's ending up in an abusive relationship. It gets to this more subtle concept of something we call trauma bonding. And so, what trauma bonding is created by is narcissistic relationships have this unique architecture of good days and bad days, highs and lows, ups and
Hmm.
downs. I love you. I want nothing to do with you. And that back and forth creates this sort of model of love and connection as a roller coaster. So then people equate that roller coaster and that idea of like, okay, this is a bad day, but oh my gosh, we're going to work towards another good day. That sort of chasing the kind of high of the good day becomes what these relationships look like. So what that means is that when a person who has been in narcissistic relationships meet someone like this, that whole good day, bad day, high, low plays into that original narrative of what love is. It's not even so much a seeking it out, but that when it comes, people are more likely to say, oh my gosh, we have such a connection. This relationship is so exciting. So there's this sense of activation inside the person because of that ancient familiarity. And almost a sense as an adult, you might even work through what might have been a childhood relationship. And even if you didn't have it in childhood, and the first narcissist you meet is when you're in your teens or 20s and starting to date, because the early days of a narcissistic relationship are so awesome and so hot and so fun, people find themselves trying to chase that high because ordinary people like me, it's sort of a pretty flat relationship, right?
Yeah, we're boring, right?
I'm boring. Yeah, it wasn't hot, hot, hot in the beginning, but it also doesn't go low, low, low. It just sort of it kind of stays steady. So when people get that excitement, I mean, we unfortunately we live in a Disneyfied fairy tale culture where people still think that they should have this sort of mythological kind of a relationship rather than understanding that slow and steady is the person who's going to change your diaper when you're 85 years old.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I remember when I was younger, a lot of female friends of mine would say something like, yeah, I date jerks, period. And I remember thinking, why? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And there was a part of me where I was like, well, maybe I should just do that because it'll make dating easier because look at all my female friends. And then I was like, no, it's not really me. And there was I couldn't articulate, but I thought that sounds hard for me to do. It's really inauthentic. I'm not going to last long doing that. And also, what's wrong with these people? And I hope they grew out of that because we were like 20 or 19 and maybe they did. I feel bad for the ones that didn't. Statistically, there's going to be a few and they're probably divorced twice or whatever.
More
if they're
than
lucky, they're divorced, I guess. They're not with the same.
Correct. Correct. And I think that there's sort of two subsets of jerk finders. I think one set of jerk finders are young, and then sort of the bad boy kind of, or the bad person, bad whatever, that's one group. But the other group of jerk finders are people who may be working through these trauma bonded cycles. They're different, right? Because the second group who might have grown up with it, and it's almost, you've been so invalidated all your life that this idea of sort of being supply for somebody else and catering to someone else's whims and needs gets a little bit programmed. So if you don't know what it is, you almost unseeingly go into that. And so until somebody really shows you what it is and teaches you narcissism bad, and this is what it is, that people will get stuck in those cycles. So there's two slightly different groups.
This seems, when I was reading the book, I noticed this, it's just so much more abusive than I had ever really thought to imagine, because I didn't put a ton of thought into it. But we as a society, if we see somebody with two black eyes and they're like, I fell again, you're like, oh my God, someone call the police. This poor person is getting beaten by this. But when somebody comes in and is just emotionally traumatized, we kind of don't know what to do. People don't want to talk about it. They maybe don't want to hear about it. We might even have less sympathy for them. Like, why are you staying with them if it's so bad? You wouldn't really say that to somebody. Most people wouldn't say that to somebody who's getting beat up. You'd think, well, she's scared or he's scared. You can't leave. But with narcissism and with other abuse, I don't know. We treat it differently.
We absolutely treat it differently. Even you had a slip right just a minute ago, Jordan, with what you said. You said even if they were just emotionally abused,
Only,
you know,
merely,
saying, merely, right? That idea of the just is. I always say if emotional abuse showed up as scars on a person's face or body, we'd be calling 911 constantly while we stood in line at the grocery store, in Starbucks, all the time, because the wounds that folks carry from these relationships that are unseen because they're not physical are profound. And so for the longest time, until only relatively recently, is emotional abuse even being regarded not only for the agony it causes a person in real time, but for the real impact it's having on a person's physical health, central nervous system, and all of that. It registers as trauma as it accumulates more and more and more and more, and that has a whole set of downstream effects for a person physically and psychiatrically. We see it in the most extreme level of emotional abuse is something called coercive control. See, that's something a more malignant narcissistic person would do, where they literally use fear and menace and isolation and financial abuse to harm someone, but they may never lay hands on them. California is actually right now the only state in the United States that formally recognizes coercive control in the family court statute. So that's progress. But you're absolutely right. If somebody were to call for help, somebody's screaming at them, a lot of people say, oh, they're just fighting. It's just drama. That's just their relationship. And it's heartbreaking because our laws aren't set up for this, right? So if a person calls the cops and says, this is happening, they're going to say, did they touch you? And if the answer to that's no, law enforcement, in some ways, their hands are tied, right? Because there's nothing on the books, on the criminal law books, to do anything about that. So we don't recognize it. And I will tell you, because anyone who's physically abused is being emotionally abused, right? Those two are going to be completely interlinked. But the people are being emotionally abused, it often can last for many, 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 many more years. That accumulation of the physical effects on people, like literally the frank physical effects, are absolutely astronomical, but and the mental health effects are profound as well.
You mentioned in the book that it can cause something called is it CPTSD?
Yeah.
What is that?
So complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or complex post-trauma, is a sort of a development of our thinking on trauma. Traditionally, we viewed trauma as very episodic. A person is kidnapped, a person is assaulted, a person is in a terrible accident, that kind of thing. A person's in combat. That's our original conception of trauma. But what we've come to find out, that trauma by definition is any time a person feels that their lives are at risk, that they're in tremendous danger. If someone is screaming at you on a regular basis, manipulating you, gaslighting you, saying, I could put you out anytime you want, you're nothing. That exposure over time, and it can often be also coupled with physical or sexual abuse or other forms of abuse. The exposure to long-term trauma, usually in a relational space, for example, domestic violence, childhood abuse, which is inescapable. So in other words, the person doesn't have the resources, a child can't get out of the situation, can't get help. That long-term exposure to trauma is something called complex trauma. And complex trauma was often unrecognized. We often use trauma as that one episode. A person was in combat or was assaulted. But that the recognition that that long-term accumulation of emotional or physical or sexual, any form of abuse or neglect, that added up to a very different kind of traumatic presentation that people experience quite differently. Even it looks a lot like post-traumatic stress, but there's other elements to it in terms of how it shapes a person's identity, how they regulate emotion, how they manage anger. That looks different in a person with complex post-trauma. It's also very physiologically held. It's held in the body. So people will say, like, I feel this physically. And so now the therapies for that are much more focused on the person's body and that connection with their mind. It's a different kind of trauma. And so the International Classification of Diseases has actually now adopted complex post-trauma and recognized it. The DSM has not yet.
And this is kind of where the secondhand smoke analogy or metaphor comes in, where you're around this for so long that you eventually get sick, maybe even sicker than the smoker spewing it out, depending on the situation.
I'd say most often sicker than the smoker spewing it out, because most people, and this is why it's great you're doing this podcast, frankly, is most people don't know what narcissism is. And a lot of people say, relationships are just hard. That's just how they are. They had a bad dad, or whatever excuse they come up with. So the person going through it, especially since no one's recognizing it, a doctor's not recognizing it, law enforcement's not recognizing it, it's not against the law. This person feels like, I'm being dramatic. Maybe I'm being extra. Maybe I'm expecting too much from a relationship. But all the while, they're getting more and more confused, more and more isolated, more and more helpless. Nothing they do works in the relationship, and they blame themselves. And so that combination, not just for a few years, but 10 years, 20 years, or if it was a person's parent, it's been happening since the day they were born, basically. That is a hell of an accumulation, and it really does take quite a toll on the person. Invariably, the narcissistic people outlive everybody else.
I think you wrote it in the book. You'd said something along the lines of, we think a bruised face requires intervention, but a bruised soul does not. And that sort of made me realize, if I'm at Starbucks and some guy slaps his girlfriend, the whole place is going to stop talking and be like, what's going on? The police are going to get called. If there are dudes with beards there, they're going to throw them out the front door, as you would expect. The guy, there'd be a reaction. But if somebody starts dressing his girlfriend down, and I'm using that example just because that's probably one of the more common combinations, maybe some gutsy females would say, like, hey, you don't say that. And the guys would be like, do I say anything right now? This is kind of awkward. And maybe someone would say, hey, do that outside or leave her alone. But certainly the cops aren't getting called. The guy's not going to get tossed out, most likely, depending on how bad the situation is. But it's actually worse because that's happening every other day. And it's just, the damage is the same or worse. And so that's an interesting thing to think about, and kind of, well, it's also really sad.
It's horrifying. And then that's why I put that line in there about the bruised soul doesn't. And I think that even the field of mental health has been slow to get on this and recognize that this simply is not okay. This is not just, we can't just communicate this away. There's no talking about this. The narcissistic person can't play at that. We're also in interesting times, Jordan, too, because we know, for example, that narcissism is consistently and highly associated with aggression and violence. So I'm going to be frank with you, one great study that was done last year by some folks at Ohio State. I think they did what's called a meta-analysis, or a study of studies, about 475 odd studies across the board. Narcissism is associated with aggression and violence. This is no joke. So I have to be honest with you. If I saw someone screaming at his girlfriend in Starbucks, I wouldn't intervene because I'd be afraid I'd get shot.
Yeah, that's what I would worry about too, especially as a guy. You say something like, "Hey man, don't do that." And then suddenly your head's getting bashed against the concrete and nobody can help you because this dude is going nuts. And then you're not even necessarily it's unfortunate because the cliche is then the abuse victim sticks up for the guy and that was all a big waste of your time. I mean, not always, but you hear about it, and that's sort of the fear that everybody has about intervening, especially in public situation. If it's your uncle or something, somebody's going to finally have the guts to say something. But if it's a stranger, yeah, you could get shot, and then what? Now my kids are fatherless because they tried
Correct.
to
You try
stop
to
somebody.
intervene. No,
Yeah.
it's a huge problem. So that's why I think people saying, "Oh, I'm going to intervene," we have to tread lightly. I mean, everything from road rage to domestic violence to stranger, all of it is associated with narcissism. And so it's not just a person who's a jerk. I mean, obviously, a person who lacks empathy and is entitled and oppositional and dysregulated is more likely to engage in violence and aggression. I mean, that makes sense. These folks actually got the data to uphold that.
So let's talk a little bit about what narcissism is, who these people are. The most perhaps enlightening bit that maybe some people will think is obvious is that narcissists feel insecure and they lack resilience. And when you're young, you don't really realize this because people who are dicks seem like they're confident. But then as you get older, you realize actually somebody who can't stop invalidating other people all of the time they're just deeply uncomfortable with themselves. Nothing is ever enough, right? Their friends aren't enough, their job's not enough, everyone else around them is not enough, and they're so great. And it's like, yeah, but you're not that great. You live in your parents' a lot of the time these people are successful, but just as much of the time they ain't shit, to put it as we would have said back when I was growing up. And yet they're somehow elevating themselves onto this plane where they're amazing and entitled.
Correct. So I think, you bring up a really important point is that we always think about the lack of empathy and the entitlement and the grandiosity and I'm all that. And it's not just the parents' basement guy who is who is insecure. It also is the multi-billionaire who can be insecure. Anyone who feels the need to preen and be pretentious and be a jerk, like, again, to me, humility is the ultimate show of confidence because you must really know you got the goods because you don't need to, scream them
Build a
from the
rocket and go to
rooftop.
space? Oh, yeah.
And Freud would have a field day with that cigar.
Oh, yeah, especially the design of the rocket. You know they had
Yes.
personal input on that.
Oh, heck yeah. So I think that the insecurity piece, though, is a tricky one because, yes, it's the core of it, right? When you think of it, think of a narcissist as having a core, like in the middle of them, like the trunk of a tree. That's the insecurity. So all the bells and whistles around them, the entitlement, I'm a VIP, I'm grandiose, look how great I am, look at my fast sports car, look at my this, look at my that. That's all like a suit of armor protecting that insecurity. Like if I talk like I'm all that, then I am all that. And that insecurity and the shame that comes from that can remain in the unconscious. So if you're the person who points out something that's not cool in that narcissist, I don't know, someone makes fun of them or there's a public scandal, well, then that shame, that insecurity, that comes out of the unconscious, it comes into awareness and they lose it. They become rageful and tantrumy and sometimes, not often, violent, but screamy, yelly, witch hunt, everyone's out to get me. That kind of, we see that whole loopy blame shifting mess. The tricky part of the insecurity, though, is some people, especially people, family members, people in close relationships, say, they're insecure. I kind of feel sorry for them. And so then they keep sticking around. And my feeling on that is, if they're that insecure, you know what they can do? Because Everyone who's in a relationship with a narcissist is going to therapy. How's about the narcissist consider rolling up to therapy and unpacking that insecurity the way the rest of us do, or the my clients do, on a regular basis, and do that hard work? Instead, what's happened is the whole world has become a giant pacifier for the narcissistic folks to throw tantrums, and everyone else is going into therapy to deal with the fallout while the narcissists just keep throwing tantrums. That's the insecurity. And so, and that's the challenge. It's a hard thing to push against, but it's almost like they're not even aware of it. And that is where it's difficult to treat, it's difficult to address, but that's the core of narcissism. It's a deep insecurity.
It seems like their self-esteem is just constantly under threat. And this makes sense because that's apparently why they need this constant stream of little wins that most of us just wouldn't really care about a lot of the time, I think. And I might be talking out of school here a little bit, or talking out of turn a little bit here, but it seems like a lot of people that I know who are just obviously narcissists, or who have even told me that they have this as a problem, when we put some whiskey in them, they need every little award, even if it's like kind of a made up thing, or they need every little accolade. They need everyone to recognize them. And it's the fragile ego on display that they can't let these little things go. And entitlement is kind of just the beginning. I'd love to talk about that because I think most people look at entitlement as maybe the hallmark trait of narcissism.
So let's talk about those accolades and the need for those accolades and awards first, right? That's part of a larger thing of something called narcissistic supply. All right? It is narcissistic people constantly need validation and admiration. Why? Because they actually have a really weak sense of self. I know who I am. I know what I like. I know what I don't like. I know my strengths. I know my weaknesses. I'm comfortable with all of them. So even when there's a threat, like, why do you never leave the house, Romney? I'm like, because I'm introverted and I don't like to leave the house. Like, I'm cool with that. Or if I don't get the award, I'm like, well, I know I did a good job, so I did the best I could done. That is not the case with a narcissistic person. Their self-esteem is constantly shaped by what's happening around them, which is why a narcissistic person may be in a great mood in the morning because they got a lot of likes on their picture, or they got good news from work. So they're on top of the world. Everyone's like, oh, they're in such a happy mood. And then at 1:00, they come to find out that one of their competitors got the promotion they wanted. Now they're full of rage. I can't believe it. Oh my gosh, nothing ever works out for me. Victim, victim, victim. You're like, what happened to Mr. Swagger from 8 a.m.? Now 1 p.m., this guy's a mess. But then at 8:00, I don't know, they get the hottest girl in the bar. Now they're back to self. So their self-esteem is a pendulum that's just constantly, it's even worse than a pendulum. It's like chaos because it's completely responsive to what's happening around them. So a lot of people feel like we never know what we're going to get with them. Getting an accolade, getting an honor, getting an award, having a ton of money, that sort of thing. That stuff goes a long way to helping prop up that fragile ego, that poorly developed sense of self. And that need, though, what happens is it's a black hole because they suck everyone in it. They expect everyone to serve that need. Everyone around them is constantly having to tell them, you're great, you're nice, we'll do things the way you want. And if you don't hit the mark with that, then they are going to get enraged because that's all they need from you. That's why these relationships feel really transactional. So that goes to entitlement.
Sure, it does. And also narcissistic supply, what a great term. It's gotta just be exhausting because I assume then that means that anybody who's breathing the same oxygen in the same room as this person is now kind of in charge of supplying this, whether they want to or not. And if you are not in a relationship with them, you're not friends with them, then, oh, well, they'll react to you poorly or great, whatever, you get to leave. But if you're dating them or they're your brother or something like that, that's almost like the price of entry to staying in this relationship is you are on the hook for managing their mood by validating them constantly. And that just, talk about exhausting. I don't even know. I'm sure there's more to it than exhausting, but exhausting and thankless probably in many ways. And just talk about you just walking on eggshells all the time. Like, okay, I've got him in a good mood. Uh-oh, somebody took that parking spot from us. The night's ruined now. The dinner's going to be terrible because this person cut him off in the way into the parking lot. I thought we just almost made it to the restaurant. That kind of thing. It just sounds horrible.
It is horrible. And it is that idea you have to bring all the supply, but you're not going to get much back from them. If it's sort of like if they're in a good mood, then everyone's about to have a good day. But you nailed it. That just when that person cuts them off or takes the parking space, the whole, afternoon is ruined. The whole evening is ruined. And so everyone with them is sort of on tenterhooks, hoping everything goes smoothly and knocking themselves out to make sure that everything goes smoothly. So everything doesn't get ruined. And it's a very one-way relationship. They have all of us almost exist to serve their needs. So anyone in the room as that same room as them is serving their need. And it really, what they don't like is if someone is more special than them. Right. Someone else gets the special treatment that they think they deserve. That's when you're really going to see them spin out. But you're absolutely, it is eggshells. It is exhaustion. It's also hypocrisy. I need to be treated this way, but I don't need to treat you this way. Mm-hmm. And hypocrisy does not sit well with us. So it's uncomfortable all around.
You're basically the emotional version. You ever seen Coming to America where the guy spreads rose petals in front of everywhere that James Earl Jones walks? Yeah, because he's the king. You're the emotional version of that guy. You've got to make sure that every step that this person takes is on rose petals. Otherwise, there's going to be a whole big thing, and it's not worth it.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And that rose petal spreading, initially what happens is, again, they're not this difficult from the jump. And I'm going to use more of an adult sort of friendship, intimate relationship kind of a model. You meet this person, they're charming, they're charismatic, they're confident, they've got swagger, they're fun, they're the center of attention, they put a lot of time into their appearance, so they're either attractive or in good shape, or they're wearing the right clothes or whatever it is, right? So now this person's paying attention to you. And so unless you know what you're dealing with, you're like, whoa, the coolest person in the room is paying attention to me. And now you get to go on a little bit of a wild ride, right? It's the love bombing. You get the good morning text, you get the good night text, how you doing? Let me take you to this restaurant. Again, all of it is them saying, look how great I am. You're saying, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. And so people are on this really exciting ride. And what narcissistic people are so really good at is they'll, excite, fun, charm, charisma, and then they withdraw. And when they withdraw, the person's like, wait a minute, where's all this fun? So now you're waiting for the text. Oh my gosh. Even if you were a little uncomfortable because it felt like too much, when it goes away, you want it back. So they go away. And then when they finally do come back, you're so relieved that you almost put up with more of their stuff. That's how they kind of get the whole cycle planted, and how they almost train people to put up with their nonsense.
Right, and we have these rose-colored glasses on, and they're charming us through the red flags probably initially in the beginning, right? So we don't see them. And then one thing that was really deep is you mentioned love bombing. Cult use that. I've talked about that on Cult Podcast, where they just make you feel amazing and special and unique, and everything is all about you, and you're never going to find it again, which is also kind of manipulative in a way, because it's like, well, you're never going to find an amazing love story like this straight out of Disney. So you put up with more stuff because, well, you're never going to find that again. Why? So you're valuing it. One thing you mentioned in the book that was really, really tricky and devious in a way where I was like, wow, that's smart and scary, was they seem to want to, I don't know if this is a flag or a tell, but they want to meet your family really fast, which initially seems romantic, but it's actually quite cunning, because then it raises the stakes, right? Everyone knows you're dating this person. The social consequences of breaking up or getting in a fight or saying that negative things about the person you're dating, the stakes are way up because the relationship seems more serious and involved. Well, this guy went on a trip with me or came to my family's house for Thanksgiving 2 weeks into our relationship, and now he's kind of being a piece of crap. But I can't tell my parents, who finally said, yay, we're so happy for you, that this guy is actually garbage and I want to get rid of him. So it's just another hook they sink into you.
Absolutely. And that part of the love bombing often gets missed, especially if a person in a more recent relationship was with somebody who's moving more slowly. Why am I not meeting their family? Why am I not meeting their friends, right? But by doing it quick, meeting friends quickly or meeting family quickly, not all narcissistic folks do this, but it often does happen. They do have you on the hook. You may feel, especially if you're very empathic, you may feel beholden, like, oh my gosh, I've met this person's family and I gave the grandmother some advice, or I played with the nephew, or whatever it is. Or you might feel like you're getting to be part of a friendship group, and so that kind of sort of overwhelming you and then creating that sense of buy-in. It's a really, really, again, devious trick, because also the person the narcissist is meeting is often quite empathic. So they don't want to just burn a bridge. They don't just want to walk away from people. They almost feel like they have to see this through, because now they're letting down these other people. And so it is quite devious. And a lot of people associate that, oh, they want me to meet their family and friends. This really is a committed, intimate relationship. They're really into me. And that's how that gets read, rather than trying to lock you down so they don't have to put so much work into the relationship anymore.
That makes sense. That's interesting. These people, is that conscious, you think, or is that subconscious, that level of devious manipulation?
I think it's a mix. I mean, again, it's hard. One thing we do know about narcissistic folks is they're really out of touch with what motivates their behavior. Because if they were going to be super honest about it, that's pretty dark. Like, oh, I'm
Yeah,
doing this so I can manipulate this person. They're
right.
not they're not sort of rubbing their hands, Dr. Evil kinds of people. They really are they just sort of want what they want. What it is that because they're so superficial, they're just looking for the quickest path to do things. So I think in some ways, although what they're doing seems so devious, it may not even be as clever as we think. I think they've got a little bag of tricks, and they use it with everyone. Ask anyone who's ever broken up with a narcissist. They'll say, wait a minute, I'm seeing on social media, they're taking them to all the same spots they took me. Like, this seems like their game, like they're sort of a one-trick pony. And
Yeah.
so that whole formula seems to be the quickest way for them to get supply. I think they're not even thinking of it as supply. They're just sort of thinking of this is how it goes, and it's given them the result they want, which is somebody who just sort of goes along, with what they want them to go along with. So I think in some ways calling them devious, at least at the milder levels of narcissism, maybe giving them too much credit. At the more malignant levels of narcissism, I think the deviousness is very present.
They're almost like a drug addict who just doesn't care and has their playbook for. It's like when we think of drug addicts around here, there's a thing where people walk into a Home Depot and steal like a drill or something along those lines, right? Because the whole California shoplifting prosecute. This is kind of the narcissist drug addict, addicted to validation person's game. Yeah, I take her to this place and then we do this and then I look important and then I shower her with love and then they love me back and then I try and meet their family and da da da. Suddenly I've got this person who's bigging me up and I feel okay about myself. It's almost like an autopilot thing, but you're right. It's not exactly a master plan here. It's kind of
But
the
going back,
basics.
but going back to that insecurity, though, is narcissistic people actually don't like abandonment. They struggle with it. They have a lot of
Mm,
issues around attachment. And so for them, in some ways, sealing the deal with someone quicker can take away that insecure fear of abandonment. They are not in touch with that, right? Because to them, abandonment is like losing control. They lose control of the narrative, they lose control of the person. That's not what's supposed to happen. So the more they can lock it down, the more that they're not only abandoned, the more they control it. And so then they dominate and they over control, because that also offsets the insecurity. But many people will say, if they were the ones to end the relationship with the narcissist, it got ugly, stalky, obsessive, really poor boundaries, trying to ruin their life afterwards, spreading rumors, trying to ruin new relationships, on and on and on. So when you leave a narcissist, you can expect a cascade of this whole thing, what's called post-separation abuse. If they leave you, it's actually a lot easier.
Oh, wow. This is so interesting. I'm thinking of people that I've dealt with in the past in business, and one of the guys was never single for more than a few days. And I knew him for like 15 years. And I remember once I said, "How come you never want to be single? You'll date girls you don't even like for months at a time." And he goes, "Well," and he was abandoned by his mother. And he said, "Well, I'm always trying to replace mom. Ha ha ha." And now I'm like, wait, no, he was definitely not kidding about that at all.
Mm-mm,
And
mm-mm.
and then when I finally said, "Hey, I don't want to be a part of this business anymore. Let's amicably separate," he was like, "Okay," and then sued me and did every devious little thing, to the point where the judge was like, "What is this garbage? Do you want to get this done, or why are you constantly?" And even his own lawyers were like, "We don't really understand why our client is doing this. This is like the opposite of moving the ball forward. It's constant changes. It's almost like he wants to just keep paying legal fees." And my lawyer was like, "Well, I'm going to put a stop to this because I'm going to report this to the judge." And it became this huge mess. And I was thinking, this isn't even like a real lawsuit where this person wants something. Their goal is just to stress everyone out. That
Correct.
was it. And I thought, now you mentioned this. I'm like, well, okay, this is all starting to check out kind of well.
But their goal is to keep you in their life,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
All that
Totally.
legal contact. And again,
Yeah.
another thing you're also, sort of bringing up with what you described there is the thin-skinned nature of
Hmm.
narcissism, very thin-skinned. And so that's why they can dish it out. But if anyone critiques them or gives them feedback or even looks at them the wrong way, they completely lose it. Some people will go the litigation route. Some people will go the screaming route, stalking route, whatever it is. They're so, again, that's that fragility, that thin skin quality. But people will be confused by that because the narcissistic person will be so critical and so combative and think, well, they're a fighter. They're going to be able to take this. No, no, no. And so that sort of, again, there's that hypocrisy at play again.
That's interesting. Yes, this person fired every employee that disagreed with them, even in minor ways. If other people saw it, it was almost immediate. It was if there was like an email to everybody, like, "Hey, I think we can do this better next time." That I remember seeing a few of these and going, "This guy's not even going to be here next week."
No,
He's
and no. It and you this idea you give this example of this guy was never single for more than like a few days or a week. There's one person, I wish I could remember the name of the researcher who said this. He called narcissists disagreeable extroverts. And that really nails it because as a rule, with some exceptions, narcissistic people are actually extroverted. It makes sense. They need other people to get supply. So they do often, the pandemic was a nightmare for narcissistic people because, for someone like me, the tragedy was watching people getting sick and dying, but being told I couldn't leave my house, you couldn't have told me something better. But for a narcissistic person who needs that validation from other people, that extroversion is in that service, but they're disagreeable. Whereas some extroverts are really gregarious, right? So they need to be in the midst of people, but people like being with them. For a minute, people like being with narcissistic people, but then it gets dark. And that's where, though, that disagreeable extrovert, they can't be alone. So they go from relationship to relationship to relationship. And because they so don't want to be alone, they're often cheaters. They do. I would say the vast majority of relational cheaters are narcissists. Not all, but I would say the majority. And in many ways, they're just trying to get their next gig worked out before they leave the last one because
yeah.
they just don't want to be abandoned.
This guy is definitely a cheater. I mean, I saw it many times firsthand because lived with him for a while. You can't hide it from somebody you live with, and he would and it was almost like I'd be like, "Hey, man, this is awkward for me to see because I've known your girlfriend for 5 years," and he's like, "Well, you didn't see anything," and I'm just thinking like, "Ugh." You don't even have any regard for the other people that are going through. But I just thought, oh, he's kind of I never put it together. And one of the reasons was because he wasn't somebody who would yell at somebody, "Do you know who I am?" or be really obvious about it. In fact, he would kind of go, "Okay," and then privately would have the meltdown, and everyone would have to manage this person's emotional nonsense for a week about how they were slighted by the waitress or the door guy at some bar.
But that whole like having the tantrums in private, being really thin-skinned, oh, I've been so slighted. What we often think of narcissism as the big, grandiose salesperson, attention-seeking center of attention, right? But what we forget is that the underbelly of narcissism is something called vulnerable narcissism. That's where we see this. For a week, you had to talk the guy down because the waitress slighted him. It's very victimized, sullen, resentful. Everyone's out to get me. I never get a fair shake. Nothing's ever fair to me. That very sullen, resentful, always a grievance about something or someone. That is something called vulnerable narcissism. And so those folks may not be as big in public. They may actually seem a bit more grumbly and like, oh, I can't believe this idiot is making more money than me. I'm so much smarter
Yes.
than anybody else. That's the vulnerable narcissistic presentation.
That is way more spot on because there was a sense of entitlement. But you're right, grumbly is the perfect word for this person as well. It was like I remember often because I've known his significant others and his other friends, and something would happen and we would look at each other in the back seat of the car like we would all roll our eyes like this is the rest of the night. That's where I came up with the example of somebody taking the parking spot because I was like, well, good luck with this guy now for the rest of the night on your date. This is going to be miserable. I'm glad I'm not joining you for dinner because this is all you're going to talk about. And it was just, yeah, this makes perfect sense now. excessive reference to others for self-esteem, constantly comparing yourself to others, the sense of entitlement. The thing is, though, with a lot of these narcissistic traits, celebrities and executives, they have a little bit of entitlement a lot of the time. Regular people do too, but it's not necessarily narcissism, right? And comparing yourself to others, I feel like a lot of healthy people do that. It's not a healthy habit, but that happens a lot. Doesn't make everybody a narcissist. So narcissism seems like a, a combination of a bunch of things that probably all of us do, but taken to a degree that makes it like a mental illness.
Well, you need the combination, right? So, like, if I put a tomato in front of you, Jordan, you wouldn't
Hmm.
say that's salsa. Okay, you'd be
Right.
like, that's a tomato, right?
Sure.
Central ingredient for sure, but you need more than a tomato to make salsa. You need more than entitlement to make a narcissist.
Hmm.
So that person who is the little bit of a diva when they're in line, and you see that in people of privilege, like people who have grown up with wealth or have wealth, and their feet rarely touch the ground. There's handlers, like, like sacre bleu, they have to wait in line at the airport kind of thing. They're not awful people. I mean, I know people like this in the industry, and I'll watch them in a restaurant because I'm thinking like, wow, and they get things done. And so they're so used to, again, a frictionless world, that when it's not, they get a little snappy. But I've seen the depth of their empathy, and if I were to correct them, put a gentle hand on their shoulder and say, oh, that's not a good look, they'll say, yeah, you're right, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have done that. And so they will not. Whereas a narcissistic person, if I said, oh, that's not a good look, they'll be like, shut the F up.
Yeah.
So there would be a rageful reaction. But you need these things in a row. You need the entitlement. You need that spotty empathy at best. You need the validation seeking. You need the grandiosity. Like, it's not just the tomato. You need the whole thing, and it needs to be consistent and seen in a variety of situations and have been there for a long time. So that all put together gets us away from the idea of the person who is, I don't know, just so fancy that they don't have to wait in line, so they're a little bit thrown off when they do. And but they actually are, they do have intact empathy and that sort of thing. But let's face it, if you are a celebrity, you have voluntarily signed up to put yourself in this position, and at some level you need that applause. If really it was about the craft of acting, then you'd be content in a community theater, right? You want your name on the marquee. You want all the attention. You want the seas to part when you approach. And, research has shown, even sort of anecdotal survey research, celebrities are significantly more likely to be narcissistic. CEOs are significantly more likely to be narcissistic. So there's a draw. I mean, it's a chicken egg issue, right? The personality probably draws the desire, but most normal people don't want to be famous.
This episode is also sponsored by INVESCO. Here on the Jordan Harbinger Show, we're always talking about improvement. We're sharing some wild stories. We talk to these fascinating people. On Feedback Friday, we're always trying to help y'all out. I actually get a lot of investment questions. It's hard for me to give that kind of advice, but you want a diversified portfolio. And thanks to INVESCO, we can help share some info here. Why invest in ETFs? Because there's a solution for whatever your portfolio needs. Whether you're exploring ways to manage volatility, seeking income and diversification opportunities, or looking for tax management strategies, Invesco has over 200 ETFs to help you meet your financial goals. Discover the possibilities at Invesco.com/ETF solutions. Before investing, consider the fund's investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Visit Invesco.com for a prospectus with this information. Read it carefully before investing. Risks involved with investing in ETFs, including possible loss of money. ETFs are subject to risks similar to those of stocks. Invesco Distributors, Inc. Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. I think a lot of people are going to think they're narcissists after hearing this, and I want you to tell us why this is often not true. I like the tomato salsa example, but it would seem to me that the people who are going to email me overly concerned that they're a narcissist and need to apologize to everyone in their life after hearing this are exactly the type of people who are not narcissists, right?
So I'd say this is where self-reflection matters. And what we see is that people who have been in long-term narcissistic relationships, they're actually the ones who often call themselves narcissists because the narcissistic person called them a narcissist, right?
Aha.
So there's
Yeah.
already that piece to it. And I think too that a person who's self-reflective and says, "Oh, I was a little bit difficult with that receptionist today," or I don't want to listen to my sister's marriage problems right now because I'm tired. Like that's normal, right? Empathy doesn't mean that you're an emotional doormat for everyone who comes by and you stop your day to listen to every single person's problems. I mean, you can be empathic and you can have boundaries. So when I get that question from people all the time, I'll say, slow down and really think that, do you care about and understand other people's feelings? Are you able to check yourself and pay attention to how your behavior affects other people? Or do you actually really believe you're too special to wait in a line? Or do you actually wait in line, but one day when you didn't get enough sleep and your kid was sick, you got a little snappy with a receptionist, but that's not your usual you. So I think that people have to look inward. But where it gets really interesting and wonky these days is the social media of it all, right? So multiple studies have shown a correlation between people with more narcissistic personalities and posting selfies. And it's not exactly rocket science. Posting a selfie doesn't make you narcissistic. Posting a selfie and being unempathic and being entitled and needing validation and having contempt and being rageful and not managing your emotions, that's narcissistic. So just because you're on social media doesn't mean you're narcissistic. Just because you like to post a picture doesn't mean you're narcissistic, right? So I think that there's people out there who say, oh, it really matters to me if I get likes. I would say to them, what is that about? Because for some people, that's anxiety. They're so worried about, they're socially anxious. They care about what other people think. But if they really have all that other stuff too, yes, they want that validation and all that other stuff. That's when we're talking about narcissism. It's really important, again, to not call the tomato salsa.
The superficial Instagram life is quite interesting. It seems perfect on the outside, but on the inside, it's like a VH1 behind the music expose, right? And I I know so many of these people. Do you think social media slash Instagram, do they cause narcissism or do they just attract it? Because it seems like Instagram is the perfect magnet for this.
It attracts it, right? And so where I take umbrage at some of the folks on social media, I think a lot of it is harmless. I think most of it's vapid, emotionally stunted, immature. Like it's just not fully formed. It's sort of they're kind of like sort of unformed children. That's Instagram. That said, what I don't like about it is the selling of the artificial narrative, right? So because the narcissist is the masterful at selling the false self, at putting on the mask. And that mask actually does harm to other people. So when you see the new mother who's perfectly svelte and her makeup is done and her house is clean, I'm like, bitch, I want to take you out. Like this is not how it is. Other new mothers are just like leaking milk and are crying and
Yeah.
don't feel they're doing it right, are terrified for their kids, and they're eating stale bread. Like that's motherhood. And your child in their white onesie looking cute, don't do that. Not okay. People who are showing these weight loss stories that are actually really stories of eating disorders and other abuse of their bodies, not okay. And so I think that piece of it, I can't even say though that the people who post that stuff are narcissistic. I think they're probably not self-aware and they may just be immature. So I think a lot of Instagram is just incredible immaturity. It's teenagers who are all seeking attention, but the teenager happens to be 50.
Yeah.
That's the challenge there. But what I do think it attracts narcissistic people, that a person could spend 4 hours a day staring at Instagram, editing images, photoshopping images, putting them up, waiting for the likes, and that's what they do. That's not a healthy way to go through the world. They're not cultivating healthy relationships. It's not a reciprocal mutual relationship where there's a back and forth. It's very much a sit here and wait for my validation. It's not healthy. So, but I don't think it creates narcissism. Narcissism's developmental. It's created through a variety of events that happen in childhood and all of that. So a person who's a really well put together, empathic, self-aware human being is not going to turn into a narcissist because they go on Instagram. No.
No, that actually makes a lot of sense. I want to go through some sort of classic traits here. Another one is projection. Can you tell me a little bit about this? Because this, well, happens to be something that I noticed with all the people in my life where I was like, who do I know that's like this? It's always somebody else is doing it. And then you go, but that's the thing that you did literally yesterday. And now it's a little bit like gaslighting and projection almost. They form together in the same painting with these people.
So all of us engage in projection sometimes. It's a primitive defense. And what projection is designed to do is when sort of uncomfortable, unconscious parts of ourselves are getting activated, usually shame inducing, we ping off. We pretty much take that it's not an active process. We're not thinking. We just deflect. And that projection is that defense. It protects us. We don't have to, deal with that ugly, ucky, unconscious stuff. And by projecting, we make it someone else's problem. Like accusing someone of being a liar when they haven't lied, but in fact you're struggling with your pattern of deceit. Accusing someone of being like sexually inappropriate or having poor boundaries with other people when those poor boundaries and inappropriate behavior is your thing. It's projecting your stuff on other people. We all do it sometimes, right? The thing is, the narcissistic person does it all the time. It's a core of the blame deflection and all of that. But it's a very primitive defense. And ideally, we grow out of it. We develop self-awareness and we don't do it, right? So if somebody comes to us with a criticism, instead of boom, deflecting, we might take a second and say, I need to sit with that because that seems really on point and I need to work on that. I mean, you need some evolution for that. Narcissistic people don't get there. So projection is their defense of choice. And so they're constantly accusing people of stuff you're like, huh? And the huh means it's likely their stuff that it's basically they're vomiting on you and you're in the splash zone.
Yeah, it was always so interesting because going back to some of these examples of folks that I know, they would say something about somebody, and I'd go, "Well, okay, don't we all do that?" But then I was like, "Wait a minute, you do that especially, and also this other person really almost never does that. And also, aren't you talking about something that happened 2 days ago where we were all there, and this is 100% you?" And they didn't seem to notice it. I thought either you're a really good actor, or you lack self awareness to the point where you don't even realize that you're doing this and other people are not. And the jealousy was there turned up to 11. The gaslighting was there turned up to 11. And I started having to write things down after dealing with them because they would go, "We're going to do this, 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 and this." And I'd go to a meeting the following Monday. I mean, 4 or 5 days later, and they'd say, "Well, I told Jordan to do this, this, and this, and he didn't." And I'll go, I wrote this down where you said you were going to do that, and then you didn't. And now you're blaming me and saying that I agreed to do it. And now I'm not the crazy one. You set me up for this. And it would happen constantly. And I can only imagine if that is you, but your parents are doing it, it's got to just be a million times worse.
Well, if your parents are doing it, what the child does not have the luxury of saying, "Yo, mom, stop with the projection. You're gaslighting me," right?
Right.
The child has one need, and those are attachment needs, right? So they can't afford to cut off that attachment to a parent. The parent is the source of food, shelter, but above all else, the perception that they are also the source of emotional and psychological nurturance, of safety. So when this is happening to the child, what does the child do? They internalize the projection. I am a bad kid. I am a liar. I did do that. I must be awful. And that kid slowly morphs into, I'm a bad kid. Because instead of the parent taking ownership of their subpar behavior, they project onto the child. They literally resent the child for having any needs, as though the child is a burden, and they in a million subtle ways they let the child know it. So what does the child internalize? I'm a bad kid. I'm a bad person, and that trails them into adulthood.
Yeah, ugh, that's awful. Another trait, seeking out high status friends. I know a lot of influencers just by virtue of the fact that I'm in this industry. And there are some folks, most of the people in this industry are fine, great, normal, whatever. But I've literally had this conversation where someone will go, "I only hang out with famous people or people who are going to improve my brand." And I'm thinking, you said the quiet part out loud. You might not want to advertise that. You sound a little bit psycho when you say things like that. And I had one friend of mine come to me and say, "I went to so and so to be on their podcast, and they literally told me I wasn't famous enough." And I go, "Didn't you just do a bunch of consulting with that guy for like 6 months where you helped him for free with all this stuff?" And he's like, "Yeah, I did. And I didn't charge him for it." And then when I wanted to promote my book on his show, he said, "I only want big name people and people who can enhance my brand." And I'm just thinking, it's gotta just be lost on him how crazy that sounds. But he'll tell you. And I thought, I don't know if I admire that or if I'm just in shock because the honesty is just unbelievable. It's kind of, you might as well have a t-shirt that says I'm a horrible, shallow person and wear it every day.
That idea of I only want people around me that enhance my brand is really the beautiful 21st century way of how of what a narcissist is about, right? They do only want people around them who enhance their brand, which is why, you'll see that, for example, the trope of the older man with the inappropriately younger,
Yeah.
attractive partner. She's supply, right? She's enhancing his
Mm,
brand. And so, and whatever variant that works as fame, fortune, notoriety, whatever, people, status, people want that. And that's what narcissists want, that, I should say. And so they you know what? In a way, what I like about someone saying it out loud is that then it's buyer beware. If
right.
you're keeping company with somebody who's saying, I only want to be with people who enhance my brand, that might be the time you say, I need to go use the bathroom and not come
Right.
back.
Right. Yeah. This is a person. I know this person's ex-girlfriend, and she's so nice. And he just like he literally, one of the reasons they broke up was he was sending dick pics to everybody on Instagram that he could find. And then some other girl with more followers who was famous in another country started replying, probably the same, same issue as him, wants somebody who enhances her brand. And these people were house shopping, and then he dumped her kind of out of the blue after they had a fight about him sending dick pics, because he's like, well, I didn't do anything. And I'm like, well, one, you did, because the rumors are flying everywhere that you're a cheater. Two, sending dick pics to people you don't know on the internet is basically the same thing. And three, now minutes later, you're dating a different girl with more Instagram followers. And then they got the exact same type of dog that he had in the previous relationship, and started taking the same kinds of photos. And I remember thinking, okay, one day I'm going to talk to a psychologist who understands exactly what's going on. And this is that day, Dr. Rami.
There we
This is
go.
that day.
And that idea of, we people live in that fear of they're going to want to trade up the trophy partner. That narcissistic people do
Hmm.
that. I mean, because it's transactional. They're choosing on the basis of status. So trading someone out for somebody who is quote unquote better for their brand, that's what you're going to see with a narcissistic person. The challenge becomes, though, Jordan, is that the person who is left, the person who is rejected, the person who is no longer on brand, their tendency is to internalize it and wonder what's wrong with them. Am I not enough? Right? You're more than, you're a human being. So by dint of that, you're more than enough. But the fact of the matter is that it's a transaction. So the problem lies in the person who views the relationship as a transaction, and that's the narcissistic person.
Right. So these people also, I know, spend a lot of time researching things that they covet, that they want, because they always want something new, something better,
Mhm.
something more on brand. But the hole never fills
Mm-mm.
because it's unfillable. So, like you said, the other person says, am I not enough? It doesn't matter who you are, because you can't be enough for them.
Mm-mm.
It's a
The
black hole.
It is a black hole. And so, I always, when I would teach students about narcissism, I'd say, I want you to think of a bucket with holes popped in the bottom, and you're pouring water in it in good
Hmm.
faith, thinking it's a bucket you could fill. And you're pouring and you're pouring and you're pouring. And after a while, you're like, how come I'm not filling the bucket? But you never quite realize that there's holes in the bottom. And it's because most people don't understand narcissism. They don't understand the holes being in the bottom. Nobody is ever enough because nothing is enough for them. And I think that what happens is that, for example, a narcissistic person may stay. People will say, well, how is it that I know a narcissistic person and they were married for 40 years, 45 years, 50 years? It's because that relationship was serving a function for them, right? It may be that they were able to come off as the family person in public, or they liked the facade of it, or they liked the comfort of the relationship, or they liked, whatever it is they liked about it, they kept that, right? So it's almost like if you go to my kitchen, I've got a food processor and I've got a coffee maker and I've got a, whatever the heck else I have, a teapot. I'm not going to throw out the teapot because I have a food processor. I need both of those things. That's what a narcissistic person views of people as almost as kitchen appliances. So they may stay in the long-term relationship because that's serving them a function, but then they want the other thing, which might be, a relationship on the side or whatever, because it is never enough. So they often switch up their supply and make their supply more, I don't know, diverse, as it were, and get different sources of it. But nobody can be enough because it never is enough. Like, for example, they just want to be, I don't know, the emperor of the or empress of the world. Like, they want to be in charge of everything. I mean, there's a point, I guess there's some people like that in the world
Sure.
and who have that kind of power. And my guess is I don't know if we call them satisfied narcissists, because if they were, they'd probably be sharing their wealth, and they're not. So they're not. They're
Hmm.
narcissistic, and obviously having all that money matters to them.
Yeah, there's a lot of envy and trying to create lives that other people envy. But of course, that envy is toxic and causes them to wreck their existing life with their happy partner and their kids because they want to get things that other people will envy. And that's what's so tragic about this, right? Is you see people who have what should be a great life because they have a great person and they have kids and they have a good business, and but then they will sacrifice all that for another person that has more followers on Instagram. And you're just thinking, what are you doing? You were holding happiness in your hand and then you splattered it on the ground to go get something shiny.
So envy is a two-way street in narcissism. It's interesting, and it's even built into how we clinically think about narcissism. First of all, narcissistic people envy other people. They envy the person who has the fancy airplane or the fancy car, or even, I don't even know. I mean, it depends on where you fall in whatever they've got that you don't have. They envy other people a lot. But on the other side, they think other people envy them, or they want to create a life where other people envy them. So they want to get the fancy things, or they want to put the life out on Instagram. In fact, a psychiatrist friend of mine once said to me, she said, Instagram is literally a tool that was perfectly designed to induce envy in other people. That's almost like its only function is to make other people envy you. And that need for other people to envy you is an incredibly, incredibly unhealthy dynamic to be hitting the world with. And that's and listen, I know some people are going to say, oh, I wanted people to kind of be jealous of my vacation to Paris. Does that make me a narcissist? Maybe not, but take a look inward on what that's about. Why would you want anyone to have to hold that negative mood state of envy about you? And there's likely an early core reason in their lives for that, because it's a healthy person wouldn't want somebody to envy them, And in fact, there's the humility of like, oh, maybe I'm not going to let people know this about me because it could make them uncomfortable or make them feel, less than. I never want that. That's a healthier approach. But that envy piece is absolutely huge. But then you said something interesting about happiness. They were holding happiness in their hand. They don't understand happiness, right? Happiness is a very deep quality that all the research about healthy folks suggests it's very much about mutual, compassionate, respectful, reciprocal relationships. Well, narcissistic people don't have those. So for happiness for them is a very fleeting state. It's usually the thing right in front of them, as long as they feel like they got a new shiny thing. But that means you need a new shiny thing all the time. So for that person, they thought they'd be more happy, as it were, with the new shiny thing. But that's because this thing called happiness, they don't really have they don't have a deep hold on that particular construct.
Some other quick traits: generous only when it serves them or they can make a show of it, which makes sense, right? Why be generous if you're not going to get some brand enhancement from that? We talked about dysregulated patterns, the anger, the rage, where things just seemingly are the disproportionate reaction to something. Grandiosity, one of the other hallmarks. Cult leaders and conspiracy theorists have this, but it's like the big new app idea, the business they're gonna build. And what you mentioned in the book is really interesting. The fantasy, when they talk about these things, it's confusing to other people because it's so far away and doesn't reflect reality. I live in Silicon Valley. I've seen people come up with big ideas before, but sometimes it's, okay, this guy can really pull this off. And other times it's, wait a minute, you've been working here for 3 days. Why are you talking about when you're the CEO of the company, you're going to take the brand in a different direction? What are you talking about right now? None of this makes any sense.
So the grandiosity is often quite delusional. They talk about it like it's actually happening. Sometimes they'll say, I don't know, they'll talk about applying, I don't know, to an elite university or something like that. And the way they talk about it, it's almost like they're planning on going. And I'm like, it's less than 2% chance of you getting in there. But there's that, it's the 3 days in, I'm going to be the CEO. But it's a delusional grandiosity. And they do it because if they say it enough, it's almost like they're living into that grandiose experience. It's exhausting for the people around them who are like, listen, we got bills to pay today. But there's a big failure to launch with many narcissistic people. They like being grandiose, but they don't like doing the work. Because think about what starting a business is. It's grunt work, right? It's regulations, it's applications, it's getting the funding, it's writing things. It's not glamorous. It's really painful. And so unless you're like a billionaire's trust fund kid where you take the money and then you make a bunch of other people do it and then show up as the face of the company. For normal people starting a company and getting something off the ground, or even doing other things, getting an advanced degree or something, it takes work. It takes time. So they like to talk about things like they're happening because it's almost as though they experience them as though they're happening. And it's confusing and exhausting for the people around them. And it often means that things don't get done. So if you have a very grandiose boss, they will be asking for things that simply cannot happen. And so then they're angry at people for not being able to enact their vision. But people say, this is not possible, what you're suggesting. People lose their jobs as a result until the grandiosity is finally found out by someone. Look at someone like Elizabeth Holmes, the lady with the Theranos, right? It's a great example of that kind of grandiosity. I'm going to take, a tiny drop of your blood and be able to tell you everything about your health history ever. I knew having some science training, I'm like, that doesn't seem realistic. Like, it just doesn't make sense how they run assays. But what did I do? Because my first thing was like, oh, maybe I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. But, I think anyone in the sciences was like, huh? And then she got these billions in funding. And I think just other people like, whatever, that's your billions, not mine. But we knew it wasn't going to work. And yet she held on to it to the bitter end. And that's how these things often crash and burn.
Yeah, there's so much here. We have to skip some of the signals just in the interest of time. Passive aggression, Schadenfreude, something that everybody else does, being happy when others fall. But the flip side of this is rationalizing the wins of others as less meritorious. Like, she slept her way to the top, or it must be easy if you're so and so. I've had people say like, oh, well, you're successful because you inherited a bunch of money. And I'm like, my mom was a public school special education teacher. By the way, also still alive. I didn't inherit anything. My dad was an auto worker. He's an engineer. Also still alive. What are you talking about, man? I inherited it. No, I worked hard and I got a lot of luck because of the market timing. But like inheritance, geez, pick a different sort of boogeyman here, buddy. But I do get things like that, or people being like, I've been doing a podcast for as long as you, and your show sucks compared to mine. And I'm like, oh, you're just obsessed with this concept of, and I'll put this in air quotes, fairness, where you're better than everyone else. And they're just obsessed with this. And I noticed that as well about people I know, I guess, in real life who exhibit this is everyone else who's doing well has somehow done so either because through less meritorious means, or is just purely lucky. And when am I going to get my due is just the constant refrain. And it's like, well, I don't know, maybe get up before 11 a.m. and work.
But it's interesting. So it's an interesting kind of like backstory to the Schadenfreude, right? So Schadenfreude, for people who don't know, is a German word. Leave it to the Germans to have one handy word that gets to this, which is the glee or the pleasure one experiences at another person's misfortune. Not so nice. We've all done it. We've all done it. So folks, if you have experienced Schadenfreude, doesn't make you a narcissist. And in fact, when we often experience the most Schadenfreude is when the narcissists themselves fall. So that's all good. The difference is how, with a narcissistic person, the Schadenfreude is so cruel. Like, they'll kick a person when they're down. They will mock them. Because Schadenfreude, to me, if you kind of do it in private, you're like, look what happened to that one, and then you're thinking it. That's very different than getting up in the face of someone and saying, yeah, loser, and you're like, well, this person's already going through something, whether they deserved it or not. Like, maybe let it go. So the narcissistic person, it's an absolute enveloping glee that they experience. Now you talk about that other sort of an interesting flip side of, if anyone else succeeds, it's luck or inheritance, like you put it, or, that kind of, or they slept their way to it, whatever sort of dodgy way that they got to it. Whereas if I'm not getting there because the world isn't fair to me, but the piece they never account for is they're not doing the work. Right? Or they'll say, I've made my podcast as long as yours. Really? But have you? I know, having a podcast myself, the hustle involved, the time, and you even still don't know what, the audience is going to take what the audience takes. And if mine is not as successful as someone else's, the idea is for me to be circumspect and say, either this isn't resonating, or I need to step up my game in terms of that. But it's not, Jordan is not good. It's Ramani's not trying hard enough. That conceptualization is never going to work for a narcissistic person because it's too much of an ego threat. But if you're their friend, it doesn't feel good when they're saying, "Oh, Jordan, you got ahead because of this inheritance from these poor living people
Yeah.
who are." So it's a the that what it does is it diminishes what you've worked hard for, and so it's really hard to maintain a friendship in that when you constantly feel that that's happening. And it's sometimes people in these relationships feel guilty at succeeding where the narcissist is not. They're like, I'm not going to tell them that I did this or got this because I don't want to hurt their feelings. So a lot of people in narcissistic relationships actually learn to just silence their own accomplishments so they don't hurt the narcissistic person's fragile ego.
Also, these folks are often vindictive when slighted because, and you said this makes so much sense. External image is all they have. So they have to be vindictive when slighted because if somebody slights me, it doesn't feel good, but I'm probably not going to think about it for more than a few minutes. And even that's too long. But we've all seen the person who cannot ever let anything go. And it's because these slights, these tiny little things are elevated to primary importance because they don't have anything else going on. I thought that was really enlightening as well. And also paranoia. I didn't see this one coming. They often think that other people are out to get them, which I guess if the focus of the whole world, according to you, is also you, that makes sense. But these folks are prone to racism, nationalism. That really is interesting. I'm wondering if you think there's a rise in that too, because it sure seems that way from watching the news.
Well, think about it, right? So, at any ism, the willingness to dismiss an entire group of people reflects not only an entitlement, but a lack of empathy. How could an entire group of people on the existence of something like race or, whatever it is, it's an absolute unseeing of another human being. And so, what it does, though, is that there's this, and this is if you want to radicalize or create nationalistic movements, you try to foster an us-them mentality. And so, if I'm in the group that's better, then I'm great. And narcissistic people are always looking for ways to pump themselves up. So what better way to do it than the other group is bad and I'm great? And that could be anything from sports teams to race to whatever, the town someone's from, nationality, religion, pick something. And so that it speaks to sort of the mental weakness that is narcissism, because it's that need to sort of say that the group I'm in is great, thus I'm great, rather than, it's another group of people. I can get to know people as individuals, but the constant threats that narcissistic people feel from the world, just like with the paranoia, narcissistic people have something, the fancy term for it is hostile attribution bias. And hostile attribution bias is the attributions you make for other people's behaviors, like somebody who may look at you in a store is always hostile, like it's threatening, versus maybe they're looking at me in the store because I remind them of someone, or they think they recognize me. No, they're out to get me. What are you looking at? That kind of thing. That's the hostile attribution bias. And that's a very classical part of narcissism.
The other behavior in the outer world is inconsistent with their inner world. And the example that slipped right out and hit me in the face was that CEO who got famous for paying $70,000 a year wage for his payments company, and he was in the media and he was all writing on LinkedIn and he was this big deal and he's always like, the corporate America, they're taking too much. And then now his current thing is a dozen plus women saying he sexually harassed and or abused them. All of his exes are coming out like, yeah, this guy's a total bastard. I didn't say anything because he was in frickin' Forbes for being the best CEO ever and paying everybody a living wage and coming out against greed. And it turns out he's just maybe he's generous with money because it gets him validation, but he's also gropey and gross.
Correct. And we see this all the time in these big, these increasing numbers of corporate scandals, a lot of which we then sort of really start escalating during Me Too. And they're all the ones that never got documented prior to Me Too or the people died, is that idea of the person who is viewed as the titan, the genius, the generous one, the philanthropist is behaving in this horrifying way. That inconsistency, though, it actually speaks to sort of the inconsistency they themselves feel. Remember, it's very simple to understand narcissism. They need validation. So if they're like, oh, if I give these people a lot of money and be Mr. Philanthropist or Ms. Philanthropist or whatever, then I'm going to get a lot of validation. I'm going to do that. That seems like a good thing to do. It's not out of a love for the cause or anything like that. In fact, they often have contempt for the people they may be trying to benefit. It's just that they're going to get recognition. And what they're not going to do is give that money quietly, right? So they're going to make sure there's galas and posts and aren't I great and look what a humanitarian egalitarian I am and blah, 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 blah. But we come to find out they're screaming at their household staff. They're sexually harassing and abusing people. But then there's another level to this. Harvey Weinstein's a great example. Anyone in the industry will say everybody knew he was behaving badly for years, but everyone wanted to be part of the Miramax miracle machine. Everybody wanted their name affixed to a big project. Let me get that on my name, then I can distance myself from this monstrous guy and I can go make it in this dream industry, right? So the fact of the matter is, whether it's a Bernie Madoff, whether it's a Harvey Weinstein, anyone who's got that level of notoriety but was able to get away with the stuff behind the scenes, people will often soften those edges so they can get what they want from that. That's something also called cognitive dissonance. We want the pieces to fit, and if they don't, there's a sense of tension. So we're going to tell ourselves the stories we need to tell, whether as a society or as an individual. But there is often that incongruousness, and in many ways, it shows that the narcissistic person knows that what they're doing behind the wall is inappropriate, so they're creating that offset image. There's a form of narcissism called communal narcissism.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting model of it because these folks get they get their validation and admiration by being do-gooders, by being rescuers. Some you see here, like, again, some of these sort of really hypocritical philanthropists or people who are on Instagram rescuing whatever animal du jour they're doing, but doing it in their bikinis. And in the worst example, a lot of these sorts of new age folks who are out there, proclaiming the virtues of positivity, cult-like structures, all of that is in that communal narcissistic model. And what we know with the communal narcissists, when they're not rescuing the elephants or recruiting people into a cult or giving away money, they're often quite cruel and abusive to the people closest to them, people who may work for them, family members, whatever. But those people close to them can almost never get support because the world views that person as so great and so wonderful and so virtuous that nobody believes them. So there's a real cruelty to what happens to people stuck in those relationships with communal narcissists.
Yeah, there's also covert narcissism as well. Tell us the difference here from regular good old
Right.
narcissism.
So here's a chance to dispel sort of a misuse of language, right? So the covert narcissists are actually those vulnerable narcissists I talk
Okay.
about. So what happened was that language kind of got, as the internet does, like, now that TikTok seems to be supposed to be the substitute for therapy for everyone, that now what we see is that the language got morphed, and the original, the sort of the orthodox language around this, the vulnerable narcissist is that resentful, sullen. Even I made that mistake in that book. And it was interesting as I started doing deeper and deeper and deeper dives into literature, I was like, oh, I should have gotten that one right. I did my mea culpa, but it's vulnerable narcissism. Covert narcissism is the stuff we can't see. So it's their thoughts, it's their feelings, it's the stuff that's going on in their heads, right? I'm so great. And we can't see it though. It's just being reflected in their behavior. The overt narcissism would be the bragging and the arrogance and all of that. The covert narcissism is the stuff we can't see. That term, covert narcissism, is often used interchangeably with vulnerable narcissism, which is that more victimized form of narcissism.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of people maybe know someone like this, but it slips. They say, well, he's kind of a narcissist, but also kind of not because he doesn't do all these other things.
Right.
And then when I learned about covert or vulnerable narcissism, I was like, okay, definitely just that
Yeah.
instead.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Victims of narcissistic abuse can often fall for shady new age gurus. You kind of mentioned these new age gurus a minute ago. I'd love to discuss briefly how and why this happens because I see this all the time, especially when I lived in LA. A lot of these people in these weird self-help cults, they were all they had parental issues or abuse or bad partners. And I thought this is just an extension of that. And I'd go to these recruitment meetings because it was a business leadership thing. And you get duped into going. And I'm like, this is gross, doesn't resonate with me at all. I'm out of here. And other people, I check in with them 6 months later and they've been doing they're still doing it. I'm thinking, this is the dumbest thing in the world. Why does this appeal to you? And they're just getting sucked into this, just like they got sucked into the bad relationship with the last
Right.
3 guys they dated. or whatever.
It's we look at that. What is it? It's things like having to earn yourself, earn your place in the relationship. A lot of them have levels, right? You go from this level to that level to that level. That's so much the architecture of a narcissistic relationship. Or win me over more. There's a lot of money that exchanges hands. But what it is that a lot of these sort of toxic new age types is they shame any kind of negative emotion. Oh, if that didn't happen for you, I guess you didn't try hard enough. You're not manifesting hard
Right.
enough. That's on you, versus really giving a holistic look at it. And a person who's vulnerable will very much fall for that kind of nonsense. And under the kind of the billing and the community that these new age folks bring, come and we're going to have crystals on the beach. But then you're like, what is happening? Like, you're blaming these people for circumstances in their lives they had no control over. And so, and what happens too is that these organizations will often isolate. Oh, your friend is telling you that this isn't cool. You're letting too much negative energy into your life. The place to start is to hold this pink crystal and tell your friend you don't want to talk to them anymore. And so now they start isolating these people from the sort of the counterweights in their life, sort of get more and more isolated. And before you know it, you're all the way in. And that it's a systematic indoctrination in these, but you need a person who is often looking for answers, and like you said, some of them are even, it's not even just vulnerable people trying to like work out soul pain. Sometimes it's just people, business leadership. I know exactly what you're talking about. And that people get into this and like, oh, this was the answer to everything. But really what it is that they often take this very basic principles of positive psychology and cognitive behavioral psychology, and they repackage it as like, your mind can control everything.
Right.
There's all, you're only using 2% of your brain capacity. No, you're not. You're using it all. Trust me. And so but they'll sell people on this sort of pseudoscience and really confusing stuff. But people who don't know, I mean, and the people who sell this stuff are very slick, very charismatic. It's all packaged really well. People will go with it because people are seeking answers. I think we're in a really existentially bruised time in human history. So narcissistic people are climbing right in there and selling sort of this kind of snake oil, and they're great salespeople.
I found it interesting that some people are more likely to develop narcissism, and it's kind of more than I wanted to go into in this discussion, but there's biological vulnerability. There's, of course, the way you were raised, and kids are inherently narcissistic. But I thought, okay, if kids are inherently narcissistic, that's why adults who act narcissistic seem like toddlers. And now that I have toddlers, I'm like, wait a second, you're kind of acting like that guy did at Target the other day. And I realize, I guess my question is it safe to say that narcissism is something we grow out of versus something we grow into? And then, of course, some people just don't grow out of it. And that's why I see the guy yelling at the cashier for squeezing his loaf of bread too hard while scanning it. Real example.
So even when I say, kids, adolescents are narcissistic, they still have empathy. I bet your toddler actually has empathy. If they sense that you or their other parent was sad, I actually think that you'd see the sadness register on their face right away. Those mirror neurons, the beginning of empathy, your single most important task as that little person's parent is to infuse them with that empathy, to mirror back, to create that back and forth. Now, the narcissistic folks don't get that from their parents. But I actually would argue that most, even small kids, even toddlers, have more empathy than your average narcissist. But that egocentricity, that self-centeredness, the child needs to have that, right? So they can, develop. All their resources need to go into turning them to the adult they're going to be. So I think that what happens is, I don't know that we grow out of it, because I think even the most tantrumy toddler isn't narcissistic. I think even the most tantrumy toddler just doesn't have the tools to be able to talk through being tired or express what they need. The narcissistic person has the language, they have the tools, they're just choosing not to use them. That's a choice. For the child, it's not a choice. Now, what happens is, there's a certain biological vulnerability or temperament. Temperament is the biological part of our personality. It's why you might even have like a funny little bit of your personality that's exactly like an uncle you've no contact with almost whatsoever. It's just, there is a biological part of it. Just things like stubbornness, agreeableness, all of that. We've seen that. Now, it's not completely, and that temperament gets shaped by the world. Narcissistic people, it's there's no good longitudinal work on this. This is speculative. We see some of this stuff in the research on borderline personality supports it a little more. Even psychopathy is supported by this. That narcissistic kids probably have people who go on, I should say, people who go on to become narcissistic adults likely have really difficult temperaments. They're the kids that are difficult to soothe. They're the kids who can't sit down. They're attention seeking. They're like, people don't like them. They're not nice kids. They're difficult kids. And it's kind of mean because they are kids. And yet they're cartwheeling through the living room. They're demanding, look at me, I'm doing a show. Look at me, look at me. You're like, oh my God. Whereas the other kid may be a little bit more serene and may be able to play by themselves. That more serene kid is going to get a lot more positive inputs from the environment than that look at me, inattentive, jumping out of their chair, difficult to soothe, loud kid. So already the world is starting to invalidate that kid a little bit too. That combination of the early invalidating environment and that biological vulnerability, that's how you create these difficult personality styles. And that's the work of even like Marshall Linehan has written about this in borderline personality, but I think it applies in narcissistic too. The problem is though too, we also have this other piece to it. We know there's some narcissistic kids out there where it wasn't so trauma-ish, abusey, invalidating as a kid. Their parents were just really overindulgent. They got anything they wanted. They never had to regulate disappointment. Everything was handed to them. They cried. Parents would do anything to stop it versus, hey, sometimes you lose kid. Like these are the parents who'd buy off the coach, to make sure their kid is a starter, all of that stuff. And that continues to even when they're in adolescence and the parents buy off the university to get them into college. And that just keeps going, right? So they recognize that there's no sort of internal, everything's external. And that's how that sort of moves into adult narcissism. And I always say, narcissism is always a story we can tell backwards with complete clarity, but it's a really difficult story to tell forwards. And what I mean by that is a lot of folks reach out to me. My 17-year-old is mean and entitled and oppositional. And I'm like, you know what? Call me in about 8 to 10 years and we'll talk. But right now they're acting like an adolescent. And so, but I'll promise you this, in any 28, 29, 30, even 50-year-old narcissist, if you're able to find the people who were witness to them in adolescence and childhood, they'll say, yeah, they were a handful. So you can tell it backwards. You just can't predict it forward.
That makes a lot of sense because I was just thinking, my kid says, look at me, I'm doing a show. But then I'm like, well, but everyone likes him and he's really kind and okay, never mind.
It.
But yeah, I guess if it can be less obvious and yeah, just wait till he's a teenager. I'm sure I was a nightmare as a teenager. I'm fairly confident of that at some level. You told me before the show that being around narcissism for a long time can actually make you sick. And I'm not just referring to the trickle-down narcissism where the victim starts to behave with less empathy because they themselves are not being given any. I mean actual physical illness, and you kind of touched on this at the top of the show. The concept of perceived partner responsiveness was something I just never heard of. Can we discuss that a little bit? I thought this was so interesting.
So you're in a relationship, right? And you have a partner, and when you laugh, they laugh with you. Most often you tell them news, they drop what they're doing to listen to you, say, I've had a hard day. They come and talk to you. Like, there's a confidence that you can go to your partner and they will respond to you in a way that shows an awareness of what you're saying to them. They're actually listening to you. And then when you bring whatever it is, good, bad, or indifferent, they respond to you. But that's not just reality. It's also how you perceive it. And that perception comes from reality, right? How this person's behaved. So that idea of, if you over time, when you're in a narcissistic relationship, you really learn that nothing I say to this person matters. They don't care if I'm sick. They don't care if I'm well. They don't care. They just don't care. And that, when you have this idea of low perceived partner responsiveness, is bad for your health. I have worked with so many survivors over the years, and I am struck by how much worse the course of their illness was than it needed to be. They did not have biological vulnerabilities and genetic vulnerabilities to illnesses that they were getting. They were developing a lot of nonspecific physical issues that didn't really track. But the chronic stress of living with someone invalidating, not having that partner responsiveness, basically living in a house full of mirrors that don't show back your reflection, is a really unsettling feeling. And we know that cumulative stress can relate to a whole host of health issues. It's a tough way to live. And I have to say, I've worked with long-term survivors, people who've been in marriages 30, 40, 50 years, and the kinds of health issues they're having. It really tracks. It really makes sense of the cumulative stress of being in the relationship. I am also struck by people who will say, one day the narcissistic person died, and within
Mm.
6 months, my health improved.
That's incredible. And I would imagine also getting sick while your partner is a narcissist
You're
is
some,
incredibly inconvenient for them, and they just view it as an annoying thing that they have
oh,
to
it's
deal with.
It's absolutely terrible. And what's so sad is some people will say, "Oh, you know what? I'm getting older. I need a companion. And gosh, when I'm older, I just need someone to care for me." I said, "They're not going to care for you. Not everyone listens." And the number of tales I've heard of people who said exactly what you just said. They feel inconvenienced by their partner's illness. The narcissistic person almost doesn't like the mortality reminder that another person's illness is. They don't like the change to their routine. Hospitals make me uncomfortable. Oh, do
Hmm.
you think they make you uncomfortable? How do you think about the person who's sick?
Hmm.
And so, what the person will find is this so called person they thought would take care of them when they're older has no problem dropping them off at the curb when it's chemo day and saying, "I'll be back in a few hours," or "Can't you find another ride home from your colonoscopy?" Or, "How could you inconvenience me?" And they won't visit them in the hospital. They won't take care of them at home. They won't even give them a meal. That's the sort of stuff the narcissistic, though, if the narcissist gets sick, oh my gosh, they expect you to
Yeah.
turn the house into an intensive care unit. But they have absolutely no capacity to take care of a sick person and will often gaslight that sick person and say, "Are you really that sick?" Or "Seems like you're making a really big deal of your symptoms." And I have to say, for some survivors, that was the moment that broke them. They thought, after all I put up with, I thought at least there was this other person in the house who would take care of me, and they actually made it worse.
Yeah. Ugh, it's so awful. And when you hear about children having to provide narcissistic supply for the narcissist
Yep.
parents, it's
Yep.
so unfair. It's so exhausting. Well, how do narcissistic parents program their kids in weird ways that show up in adulthood, right? The conditional love. The book mentions something really interesting called shape shifting, where the kids will try to suit the perceived wants of their parents, which that is obviously unhealthy. That just reaches through the page and hits you in the face when you read that.
So the narcissistic person doesn't, a parent, doesn't view their child as an autonomous individual outside of them. In fact, they're inconvenienced by the child. They're often, and what they do is they get very resentful if that child needs anything. Like, "Wait a minute, you want something and that doesn't work for me? How dare you?" And so what ends up happening is that the narcissistic parent holds all the power, right? And so what they're able to do is basically say, the narcissistic parent holds the only reality. The child is not permitted to have a reality outside of that. So when the child, for example, expresses a need, that need is shamed, or that child is viewed as disloyal. And while the parent may not say that in as many words, the child will sort of start detecting the dance. I express a need, the parent withdrew. So children are incredibly perceptive. And as they start putting together that the only way you're going to get the time of day around this place is if you do everything that that person wants, the only way you're going to be safe around this place is if you do everything that that narcissistic parent wants, then the child starts doing that. And they're like, "Oh gosh, yeah, I have no interest in soccer, but maybe if I play soccer, then my parent will pay attention. Maybe if I play tennis, one day they'll play tennis with me." So they
Mm.
try to take on the interest. "I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up because my mom's a doctor," right? So they'll talk from the age of 6, "Mommy, I'm going to be a doctor just like you." The poor kid's just doing that to be seen by the parent. So they literally just shapeshift and become whatever that parent wants, because the parent does not hold space for that child to develop into their own autonomous human being with their own needs, their own wants, that they're valuable that way, and that they love them. But the narcissistic parent, just like they are with everyone, they can't be bothered that somebody would exist outside of them. Succession's a great example of that. Look at that, the narcissistic father in Succession, how
In
he has
the
resolves
show,
it.
yeah,
It's perfect.
HBO,
It's the
yeah.
best example of that I've ever seen in a show.
Adult children of narcissists often cannot enjoy their life's successes because they overshadow the parent and are thus belittled for it and or feel guilty about it. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the culmination of all of this sort of sadness. Is even if you escape the orbit and you do well for yourself and you manage to get a happy life, there's a possibility, a distinct possibility you're going to be made to feel like crap because you're not making your crazy mom or dad the center of your world now.
From a relatively young age, if the narcissistic child outshines the parent, let's say the child is, I don't know, winning awards for something or getting attention or anything like that, the narcissistic parent isn't going to like that unless it can be harnessed in a way that the narcissistic parent is getting some form of adulation, like a stage parent kind of thing, right? Now, fast forward that into adulthood. That same ideation, let's say a person goes on to make more money than their parents or have than their narcissistic parent or have significantly more success. Either the narcissistic parent will devalue or diminish it. Well, of course you did well, kid. We took care of everything. We couldn't have made your life easier. I had to work for everything I had. If you couldn't have done that much with everything we got, you're a bum, right? So there's that piece of it. But then there's also no child wants their parent to envy them. That is too destabilizing because it takes away the grandiose idea of the parent, right? Take that into adulthood. The adult may feel guilty that they are doing better than the parent. I'll never forget a story that an incredibly successful man I had worked with. He had a very narcissistic mother. And he had said that, after he made his first billion, he wanted to buy a house for his mom in a place that she'd always wanted, that vacation house. He came from actually relatively modest means. And when he did, his mom, instead of saying, "Thank you so much for this beautiful house," she said, "Oh, well, I guess for a billionaire, this is the best you could do." So she was sort of nudging at him, and he was devastated. He said, "I felt no different than when I showed up to her with a picture I made in school and she would say it wasn't very good." Like that invalidation of her child was who she was from from the picture he made when he was 5 to the villa he bought her when he was 35. And so, but then it's also that sense of there may be envy that the parent would, again, envy them. And then the child will almost try to soften that again by buying them the house or the car, paying all their bills. But it's almost like a survivor guilt that the child has, that somehow they've surpassed the parent and that they were told from an early age that that was not okay.
Ugh, that makes me so sad. Today, my son asked why his drawings were up on the wall. And I said, because we love them. And he goes, why? And I said, well, we love everything you make for us. And he goes, I'm making another one today. And you could tell he was so happy about that. I can't imagine doing the opposite of that. It's just so heartbreaking to think about because he's so little. He took great joy and pride in the idea that he did something that we were happy enough with to stick on the frame. I'm going to tear up about my kids' stupid drawings on my show here, but it's just I can't imagine doing the opposite of that. It's so heartbreaking. It makes me so sad to think that kids are growing up that way.
Lots and lots and lots of kids.
If you're raised by narcissistic parents, are you? I know you're more likely to be susceptible to other narcissists and maybe pick narcissistic partners because of the tracks are already built, like the programming's already there. Are they also then more likely to become narcissistic themselves?
By and large, the vast majority of people who have narcissistic parents go into adulthood anxious, not aware of their own capacities, with a more they're often more vulnerable to the sense of I'm not good enough, right? That's the vast majority. Do a percentage of them, though, go on to become narcissistic? Absolutely. The fastest way to create a narcissistic adult is for them to have had a narcissistic parent. But that's not the majority. Remember that temperament piece. That is why. Because listen, there's people out there who are really nice people and they have a narcissistic sibling.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Right? Because they had the same parents.
That's a good
And it was
point.
temperament. It was temperament. They would say, and in fact, I've worked with parents who were married to narcissists. So I've worked with a non-narcissistic parent. They were married and then divorced from a narcissist, and they have kids who are now adults. And one of their adult kids is a narcissist, and their other kid's a sweetheart. And one of the things we unpack right away is how were these kids when they were small? And they'll say, oh, yeah, that narcissistic kid was a handful. But more than anything, that non-narcissistic kid was an angel, like just a sweetie, 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 like just easygoing and had a great, easy temperament and really, still got really harmed by that narcissistic parent, and in adulthood doesn't understand their value. But you need that temperament piece. You really do, to turn that person. And then the narcissistic parent has a much greater likelihood of that spinning into a narcissistic adult child.
That makes sense. It's kind of like how some metals are more magnetic than others and they react more strongly. That totally checks out. Also, I thought it was really interesting that it's not just people from bad families from families with narcissists that fall for narcissistic partners. it's often people from really great families that fall for narcissistic partners because they view everything with the lens that it's all going to be okay. And maybe they don't see this type of behavior because they've never experienced it before. Maybe they believe in fairy tales and happily ever after, and maybe they're a little naive. I thought that was really interesting because you would think it's, oh, the tracks are already there. They would recognize this is, they don't recognize it because it's all new to them, maybe.
Remember, the trick with the narcissistic relationship is that there are lots of good days in there with those bad days, right? So it'll be bad day, bad day, bad day, best weekend ever.
Hmm.
Bad month, amazing vacation, right? So you're going back and forth. But the person from the happy family gets the message: if you love enough, love saves things. If you're there enough, family matters more than anything. They get that messaging. And they believe that messaging because that's how they grew up. That's what they saw. So as a result, and even their family's like, come on, yeah, marriage is work. Sure, sometimes we'd argue, but like their argue is like, oh, I don't want a chocolate cupcake. Not this kind of soul devastating argument. And even the family can't be of much help. They're like, well, marriage, like just work harder, try hard. We'll just love them more. We're going to take you all on vacation. Again, having worked with families in this situation, I remember, again, working with a really sweet, sweet, sweet couple, loving, married forever, happy, happy, happy. They'd wear the matching pajamas, all the happy family things people do. And their daughter married a really narcissistic guy. Part of it was the love bombing seems like not so love bombing. Like, of course, people do nice things in a relationship. Then, when things started getting bad, the whole idea was like, oh, I'm not supporting them. They're going through a lot of stress. I just need to be a better partner. And the family would pipe in saying the same. Everyone believed it was fixable. So when the thing went off the rails, these parents were like, we don't know what is this, right? And these were older people in their 70s. I'm like, oh, let me teach you about this. And they said, this is not our world. And then they thought their daughter would be able to waltz into divorce court and get full custody of of her kids because the husband was so mean. I was like, slow down, folks, and I had to walk them through what family court was really about. And it was amazing to me because these were people, like I said, in their 70s, but they were as naive as children. And I kind of envied them. I'm like, God, I wish I could have gotten to that age,
Yeah.
not knowing that this lurked out there. But they did not know how to help their daughter because they had no playbook for this. So that's where I'm saying it created a vulnerability. But the good thing was, though, the daughter felt incredibly supported by her family, right? So, I mean, even at the end of the day, it's a win to come from a loving family. I just think that everyone knowing about this means that when the love bombing turns into red flags, that no love is going to rescue this. When someone's behaving like a fool, there is no beauty in the beast. You need to get out.
You mentioned family court. In the book, you note that narcissists, even if they just completely ignore your kids, view them as an inconvenience, they're still going to use them as leverage because they know it can hurt you and they can get what they want. They're not thinking this is bad for the kids to be jerked around like this. They'll take 50% custody and just make the kids watch the iPad for 3 straight days while they go off and do their thing. If it's going to mean that they won or you didn't win. Right.
Well, that's the most painful part of these divorces is that the narcissistic parent may not be interested in the drudgery of parenting, right? I mean, because parenting is a joy, but it is a lot of drudgery. And so what happens is there is that fight. It's almost like, I want this thing that you want. And so that creates a lot of it too. But also for many narcissistic people, it's not as though they're all like, I don't want these kids. They like the look of it. They're
Right.
often the Disneyland parents, right? These are the Disneyland dads. We're going to go do super fun stuff. We're going to go to super space surf camp, and then we're going to Disneyland, and then we're going to go do this, and then they didn't do their homework, right? So then the other parent is left like, oh my gosh, we've got the 4 days of homework, and you've only eaten hot dogs for 5 days. Let's look at that, and then so that other parent is in the far less lovely position of having to be broccoli and homework. I mean, that's tough after super space surf camp, and so the narcissistic parent also knows it's a look, right? Like they want to be viewed as the good parent. And so they want custody so they can get the pictures and say, look what a great parent I am. And sometimes what happens is they're not that interested in their kids. And then they meet someone new and they want to create Insta family. So now all of a sudden they'll fight to have more custody of their kids so they can bring them in with this new partner and say, look at us, we're the Brady Bunch.
Ugh, yuck. I'm getting skin crawl. I know I'm going to get emails from people who are like, this happened to me. And I'm ready for it because I love to support my audience with stuff like this. And I think a lot of people are going to see and feel some relief being like, oh, this is a thing. It's not just me having the worst luck in the world with my ex,
no.
whatever. I know that we've gone a while here, but I do want to talk about what we do if we find out, hey, there's a narcissist in my life. once you start making accommodations for these people, it's like ants at a picnic. You attract more because you're making them, I don't know, you're making a comfortable environment for them through your actions. So let's talk about how to do the opposite of that, or something that's effective for getting these people to go away or for letting us go.
So there's no easy way out if you're in it. The more significant the relationship is, like a marriage or family relationship, that's going to be a lot harder to cut ties than maybe a friendship or even a workplace thing if there's workarounds, right? One thing, and if people only get one thing from this podcast episode, is don't call them out. Do not walk up to a narcissistic person and say, "Yo, you're a narcissist." Not only is it never going to work, you're going to have to deal with a tirade the likes of which is not worth it. This is one of those things to keep on stealth. You're like, okay, now I see what this is. What do I do? And I listen, when it comes to intimate relationships, I'd say probably at least half of people stay in these relationships. They don't want shared custody. There's financial issues. There's cultural, religious, whatever. They still have hope, whatever the reasons are. I never judge a person for staying, but I tell them you're in for a tough ride. So you're going to have to radically accept that this is never going to change. There can be no more. Maybe this year it's going to be different. It's never going to be different. You need to start building a life for yourself outside of this relationship, whether that's hobbies, friendships, work, anything that gives you meaning and purpose. Throw yourself into your kids, but you're never going to get those emotional needs met from this person. And keep in mind, Jordan, I'm not talking about cases where there's physical violence. That's a whole different situation.
Sure.
I'm talking about more of the sort of the really invalidating, negating horribleness of a narcissistic long-term relationship. If, however, you're like, I want out, you need to be prepared for the fight of your life. And I think that it is unconscionable to say to someone, oh, just get up and leave. Not only is it, because I'll tell you, it's the post-separation abuse is real. You may have to endure such psychological abuse. Some people say it was almost easier to be abused in the relationship than out.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's not a worthy endeavor. Some people say, I want out. They endure it. They get to the other side, and they're glad it's over. And for those people out there like, oh, I think my narcissist is cheating on me and they're going to leave me, I'd be like, great, good for you, because that's a lot easier. When it comes to family relationships, it's a little bit trickier because you might have some family members you adore and others that are really narcissistic. It's about finding those workarounds, finding ways to be there, but also knowing. I always say to people, here's the easiest trick, and it's not easy, simple, like straightforward trick to try. If you're dealing with a narcissist, I say never go deep. And by deep, I mean don't engage, don't defend, don't engage, don't explain, and don't personalize. If you do those four things, you actually could probably survive the narcissistic relationships you can't get out of. By don't defend is when they're projecting stuff on you or gaslighting, you're like, okay, and you just sort of shrug and be like, whatever. When you don't engage, just don't talk to them. Like stick to the weather and like the neighbor's barking dog, because there's no way a conversation is going to go well. Maybe a movie you just saw. Don't explain. Like people say, let me explain my feelings to you. They're not listening. Don't do it. And then the don't personalize. It's not you, it's them. This is their stuff. It's not about you. They do this to anyone who's sitting in your seat as their partner, as their colleague, whatever. This is just who they are. They're equal opportunity offenders. This is not about you. You might be getting the worst of it because you're close to them. It is about boundaries, which are not easy to set because when you set them, they're going to get mad. They're going to bait you. They're going to try to draw you into arguments. They're going to call you names. They're going to say, oh, you think you're all that? What are you in therapy now? Is that what your therapist told you to be like this? Very contemptuous, very dismissive. But I think half the battle is the knowing it. So you don't personalize it. But there's also grief because this relationship you may have put belief in for years or decades or even a lifetime, you're kind of giving up on it. You're like, okay, this is not going to get better. And so there's a period of grief. And I tell people, prepare yourself for that. It might mean therapy, support groups, whatever you can do to sort of understand that this hurts. It's not easy for you, but I'll tell you, it's a lot easier than enduring someone else's invalidation. And I sometimes tell people, and if you're not convinced, go into what I call the tiger's cage. And so if you walk into a tiger's cage, they're going to kill you, or they're going to pull off your arm or maul you, right? If it's really a tiger. But if you're still suspicious and think it's just a sweet little cat, Walk into the cage and see how it works out for you. If indeed what you encounter, you say something to them, you talk to them, you try to communicate with them, and they actually are amenable, maybe you misread the situation. But if they start mauling you again, then there's your reminder. And sometimes people need a few of those reminders to say, okay, I'm dealing with someone narcissistic. All of us are dealing with people like this, Jordan. I have several folks in my life like this, and this is what I do for a damn living. And they're not people I can easily cut out. So it's a lot of radical acceptance. It's a very hollow relationship. I don't think about them. I never miss them. I don't care. I can't. I really don't. But I do the right thing, not for them, but for me. And I think that that's the piece to remember is I want to conduct myself in a way I consider is appropriate. But that said, I'm not getting in the mud with them.
Should we go no contact if we can? Let's say somebody has someone in their life that is just driving them nuts. It's a cousin. They they might see them once a year, maybe, but is there a point at which we just go, you know what? I can safely cut this person off, or I can stop taking phone calls from my own parents because they're crazy, and I'm an adult now.
No contact is great. It's great. If you could do it with any narcissistic person in your life, it's great. Why? Because you're not putting up with their stuff anymore. No contact is no contact, right? It's you don't talk to them, you don't text with them, you don't call them, you don't go to social events with them, you take them off your social media. You're done. It's like quitting cigarettes. I mean, you're going to feel better in 2 months, not even, maybe even the first week, or it's like quitting drinking or something. People say, I feel so much better. Now, it's not like an occasional drink. You're all out, right? Now, again, if you're co-parenting, not practical, certain relationships, it doesn't work. But the random cousin who may only show up to this or that, you might say, you know what? Call me when cousin leaves. I'm going to show up then. I can't, so no contact is such an extreme stance that it's not always possible for people. And sometimes you may be no contact for a long time, and then you have to break that. I don't know, an older parent gets sick and you're
Yeah,
the only
funeral.
person who can
Yeah.
step in, or whatever it may be. There may be situations, but then you can do the don't go deep and all those other things. I talked about the boundaries and all of that. Obviously, no contact it's a great strategy because you are protected from that. But some people will shame folks for going no contact. Oh, come on now, is it all that bad? But when you can do it, like example, a workplace is a great example. If you leave a workplace, you can go no contact with those people. You never have to talk to them again. And people who do that will say it makes a huge difference. Some people, if they never had kids and they get divorced, they go no contact. They never talk to the person again. So part of it is what is around that. But there are other forms of dropping contact, what we call low contact. And low contact is things like gray rocking.
Gray rock.
Which
This is my next thing. I love this. This is brilliant. Tell me about
Gray,
this.
gray rocking is what it sounds like. Is you basically turn into a gray rock. You're boring. You're disengaged. You're sort of boring. You're like sort of, how are you doing? I'm okay. You don't engage with them. Now, narcissistic people don't like gray rock. It's a little bit cold, abrupt. They really, really don't like it. And so it works. I mean, because they're going to escalate for a while because you're not responding to them. And then they're going to be so bored, they're just going to leave, right? But it's not always possible. You can't gray rock if you're co-parenting with someone. You can't always gray rock in the workplace. So a friend of mine who does a lot of work in family court reform and helping people coming out of narcissistic relationships, named Tina Swithin, Tina came up with something called yellow rock. And yellow rock is where you kind of liven up that gray rock a little bit. So you have manners. So when the narcissist says, it's not just like, hello, goodbye, I'm fine. It's like, yeah, hey, I'm having a good day. Or yeah, oh, sure, thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot. So there's more emotion. There's more feeling. You'd be like, oh, yeah. I went to Costco. The lines were so long today. So there's that a little bit, but you're not saying a lot of anything. And that yellow rocking for some people hits a nice compromise, but you don't ask them about their day. You don't follow up. You don't get no conversation. And if they try to draw you into an argument, like, oh, yeah, I know. So it's such a funny thing. Yeah. And then you get out of there. So like you're not, so the kids aren't seeing this sort of weird robotic communication. Colleagues aren't being made uncomfortable. Your cousin's wedding isn't getting ruined because you're gray rocking everyone. You could be a little yellow rocky and then find ways of just sort of shifting away from having anything more of a conversation with them. That's often a great way forward.
Well, I know this was a lot and we went way over time, so thank you so much. I feel like myself and everyone who made it through to the end here is much, much better equipped to spot and deal with narcissists. So mission accomplished in that way. There's so much more in the book. I've got a lot I'm going to cover in the show close with the practicals and all kinds of things people can actually do, but I don't need you to go over them because I've already taken enough of your time. Thank you so
Thank you.
much for that time and for that expertise here today. I know we're going to get a lot of emails about this, and I'm so happy to give people these kinds of tools. I just think it's so important, especially given that narcissism is not declining. If we can, is that accurate?
No, no, I think what's happening, it's not even that it's not declining. We're incentivizing it
Yeah.
more. Social media is giving them a stage. We venerate people who act like this. And so I don't know that it's increasing more, that we're rewarding it more, which means that people who will say, well, I guess it's okay for me to be like this. But that's the problem. And that means people think they should get into relationships with these people. And that's not a good idea.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.